the photograph had survived more than a century without raising suspicion. Sepia, toned and carefully composed, it showed a family of 5 seated in a modest parlor in 19 a stern father standing behind a carved chair, a mother seated at the center, with gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, and 3 children arranged with practiced stillness around her. It was the kind of image historians loved, orderly, respectable, and unremarkable. Time had softened its edges, but not its intent. This was a family preserving itself against oblivion. When the portrait surfaced during the cataloging of a long, abandoned estate, it drew little attention at first. Dozens of similar photographs passed through the experts' hands each week. But this one resisted dismissal. The longer it was studied, the more it seemed to watch back. There was something unsettling in the symmetry of the faces, in the way the children's expressions echoed the woman's too precisely to be coincidence. Their eyes carried the same narrow tilt, the same faint shadow beneath the lower lid, as if stamped from a single mold. The expert adjusted the magnifier, focusing on the woman believed to be the mother. Her features were sharp, almost severe, yet unmistakably youthful. Too youthful. A comparison was made, first casually, then with growing unease, between her face and that of the eldest daughter standing beside her. The resemblance was not maternal. It was identical, bone for bone, angle for angle, the kind of similarity only shared by those born of the same womb. As notes were taken and measurements repeated, a quiet dread settled into the room. This was no error of aging or photographic distortion. The woman at the center of the family was not the children's mother. She was their sister. And the longer the experts stared at the father's rigid posture and unreadable gaze, the more impossible it became to ignore the question the photograph refused to answer. If she was not the mother, then where was the real one, and why had history worked so hard to erase her? The first turning point begins quietly, almost invisible, rooted not in a shocking revelation but in the slow, methodical unease that comes from prolonged observation. At first glance, the family portrait appears ordinary, even comforting in its familiarity. Early 20th century studio photography favored rigid poses and neutral expressions, so the stiffness of the figures raises no alarm. The setting, a parlor with heavy drapes and modest furnishings, fits neatly within the expectations of the era. Nothing about the photograph initially suggests deception. It is precisely this normalcy that allows the truth to remain hidden for so long. The expert's role, however, is not to be charmed by appearances. Their work demands repetition, comparison, and pattern recognition developed over years of studying archival material. As the photograph is examined alongside dozens of others from the same decade, subtle irregularities begin to surface. The lighting is consistent, the exposure correct, but the faces linger in the mind longer than they should. There is an uncomfortable sense of sameness that cannot be immediately articulated. At this stage, the discomfort is not fear, but professional curiosity, the kind that arises when something refuses to be categorized. What truly initiates the turning point is the expert's decision to isolate the faces. Using magnification and digital overlays, they begin to compare facial structures individually, a routine practice when identifying relatives or confirming lineage in historical records. The children's resemblance to one another is expected. Siblings often share traits. But when the same analysis is applied to the woman identified as the mother, the results feel wrong. Her cheekbones mirror the eldest daughter's too closely. The distance between the eyes, the slope of the nose, the contour of the jaw. Each measurement aligns with uncanny precision. This is not the softened similarity of a parent seen through a child. It is duplication. At first, the expert considers benign explanations. Perhaps the photograph was mislabeled. Perhaps the woman is a governess or aunt mistaken for the mother over time. Archival errors are common, especially when estates change hands and records decay. Yet these rationalizations falter when contextual clues are reintroduced. The woman occupies the central seat, the position of authority and maternity typical of the period. Her posture is deliberate, composed in a way that signals social role rather than convenience. The children lean subtly toward her, not toward the father. Their proximity is instinctive, rehearsed through daily familiarity. The expert then compares this portrait to other confirmed photographs of families from the same region and year. In doing so, they expect to find stylistic similarities, but instead they find a contrast. In other images, mothers show signs of age relative to their children. Lines around the eyes, softened features, a visible generational divide. Here, that divide is absent. The woman looks no older than 16 or 17, barely older than the eldest child beside her. In 1911, early motherhood was not uncommon, but this stretches plausibility. The age gap is insufficient to support the role she is presented as fulfilling. What makes this turning point so powerful is its restraint. There is no sudden shock, no dramatic discovery. Instead, dread accumulates through repetition. Each time the expert revisits the photograph, the resemblance becomes more undeniable. Each attempt to explain it away only sharpens the sense that something fundamental is wrong. The expert realizes they are no longer simply identifying a misattributed figure, but uncovering a deliberate construction. Someone arranged this family to appear complete, knowing it was not. Emotionally, this moment marks a shift from academic detachment to personal disturbance. The expert becomes aware that the photograph is not merely documenting a family, but performing one. The subjects are participating in a lie frozen in time. This realization reframes every detail. The father's rigid stance now feels supervisory rather than protective. The children's stillness less obedient than rehearsed. The woman's composed expression strained by responsibility she should not bear. The image ceases to be historical evidence and becomes a record of complicity. This first turning point does not yet reveal the full horror of what occurred, but it opens a door that cannot be closed. The expert understands that the photograph is not an innocent artifact, but a mask. By recognizing that the mother is in fact a sister, the expert crosses from documentation into moral inquiry. The question is no longer who these people are, but what circumstances forced them into this configuration, and what truth required such careful concealment to survive unseen for over a century. The second turning point unfolds when the investigation moves beyond the photograph itself and into the surrounding records, transforming suspicion into something far heavier and more dangerous. What began as a visual inconsistency now demands corroboration, and the expert turns to census documents, parish birth registries, death notices, and property transfers connected to the family name. At first, the paperwork appears routine. Names recur predictably, dates align closely enough to avoid immediate alarm, and the family's presence in the region seems stable. But stability, like the photograph's normalcy, proves to be a surface illusion. The earliest census listing names the father as head of household, his wife recorded with an age that already feels imprecise. The expert notices the handwriting, slightly cramped, with corrections scratched thin enough to escape casual notice. In the margin, a faint overwriting suggests the wife's age was altered after the initial entry. It is subtle, the kind of detail only visible to someone trained to distrust clean narratives. When the expert references this with church baptism records, the inconsistency widens. The children's birth certificates list a mother's name, but that name abruptly disappears from all records within 2 years of the youngest child's birth. There is no death certificate, no burial listing, no mention in probate documents. In a time when death was meticulously recorded by necessity, such an absence is not merely unusual. It is damning. The expert considers the possibility of clerical loss or fire damage, but neighboring records remain intact. Only this woman has vanished. In her place, a new female name begins appearing in household registries, listed as the wife. The age attributed to her fluctuates across documents, as if adjusted to fit whatever role the record required at the time. The expert begins to suspect intentional substitution. This is no longer a matter of mistaken identity, but of erasure. The sister, once recorded separately as a daughter in earlier censuses, reappears as the wife, her transition smoothed by altered dates and the convenient disappearance of her predecessor. The records do not announce the change. They absorb it, complicit in maintaining the fiction. What makes this realization unbearable is how easily it worked. A few adjusted numbers, a missing certificate, and history accepts the replacement without resistance. As the expert digs deeper, patterns of silence emerge. Neighbors' testimonies recorded decades later in local histories describe the household as quiet and orderly. Words often used to veil discomfort rather than describe peace. One oral account mentions that the children never spoke of their mother, only of the woman who kept the house. Another notes that no one recalled a funeral, though mourning clothes were worn for a season. These fragments, while anecdotal, align too precisely with the documentary gaps to be dismissed. Emotionally, this turning point marks a descent into moral weight. The expert is no longer uncovering a curiosity, but confronting the architecture of a secret. The photograph now reads as evidence of an agreement. Whether coerced or enforced remains unclear. To replace a missing woman with someone young enough to be reshaped into her role. The sister's presence in the portrait is no longer merely unsettling. It becomes tragic. She is seated at the center, not because she belongs there, but because she has been placed there. The father's role becomes more ominous under this lens. Property records show assets consolidated under his name shortly after the original wife's disappearance. The timing suggests motive, or at least opportunity. Legal frameworks of the era offered women little protection, especially within marriage, and the expert recognizes how easily a woman could be removed from her own life without official resistance. The system was not broken, it was functioning as designed. This second turning point deepens the horror by revealing that the deception was not a single act, but a sustained process, maintained across years through documents meant to preserve truth. The photograph was not the origin of the lie, but its most polished expression. Every record thereafter bends slightly to support it, creating a reality so consistent that it becomes unquestioned. The expert feels the unsettling recognition that history itself can be edited not through grand conspiracies, but through quiet compliance. What makes this realization unbearable is the absence of the missing woman's voice. There is no letter, no diary, no trace of resistance. Only her name, briefly present and then removed, like a breath held and never released. The expert understands that uncovering this substitution does not restore what was lost. It only exposes how thoroughly the loss was concealed and how many lives adjusted themselves around that absence until it no longer appeared to be an absence at all, leaving behind a family that functioned, a photograph that convinced, and a truth that survived only as an error too precise to be accidental, waiting for someone willing to notice that the silence itself was the loudest record left behind, and that what followed the mother's disappearance was not grief, but rearrangement. Not mourning, but correction, as if a human being could be replaced the way a line of ink is overwritten. And once the replacement settled into place, the world simply continued, unquestioning, as though nothing essential had been removed and nothing unforgivable had occurred, and the expert is left staring at the cumulative weight of that realization, knowing that the next step will no longer be about records or photographs, but about confronting the implications of a truth that was never meant to be recovered, and what it means to unearth it now, after everyone who ensured its survival is long dead and beyond consequence, while the lie itself remains perfectly intact, still seated at the center of the image, still convincing enough to pass for a family, still daring anyone who looks closely enough to ask what it cost to make it appear so whole, and why the price was paid by the one person whose absence was engineered to be complete enough that even history agreed to forget her, until, when the silence finally fractures under scrutiny and reveals that it was never empty at all, but deliberately constructed to hide something that should not have been able to disappear so cleanly, and yet did, leaving behind only this trail of adjustments and substitutions that point toward an act so final that it required an entire household, an entire community, and an entire century to keep it buried. And the expert realizes that understanding this is only the beginning of what the photograph is actually asking to be acknowledged. Because the more the truth comes into focus, the more it becomes clear that the lie was not created to protect the children or preserve respectability, but to normalize something that should never have been allowed to survive as ordinary. And that the photograph's greatest success was not in hiding the crime, but in teaching everyone who encountered it how not to see it at all, until the very act of looking became an accusation that cannot be withdrawn once it has been made, and once it has been understood that the second turning point is not the discovery of what happened, but the recognition that it was allowed to happen so seamlessly that it blended into the record as if it had always belonged there, leaving the expert standing at the edge of a realization that will only grow more disturbing the further it is pursued, because the question is no longer whether the sister replaced the mother, but what the mother's removal required, and what kind of truth demands such careful, enduring silence to remain undisturbed for more than 100 years, and how many other photographs sit undisturbed because no one has yet learned how to look at them the way this one now demands to be seen, with the understanding that every detail preserved was chosen, and every detail missing was removed for a reason that no longer needs to justify itself to anyone alive, except the one who has finally noticed that what appears to be a family is in fact the visible outcome of something that should have shattered it completely, and that this realization cannot be unlearned once it has been reached, because it changes not only the photograph, but the nature of what historical truth is allowed to look like when it has been carefully curated to resemble something safe, familiar, and unremarkable enough to pass without question for more than a century, until the act of noticing itself becomes the only remaining disruption to a silence that was never accidental, but deliberately sustained to ensure that the wrong person remained at the center and the right one was never allowed to exist again as anything more than a gap in the record that no one was supposed to question. And now that gap has widened into something impossible to ignore, something that does not end cleanly, but continues to open outward into implications that refuse to resolve into anything resembling closure or comfort or certainty, because the truth uncovered here does not conclude but destabilizes, leaving behind not answers but a growing awareness that what was replaced was not just a woman, but the boundary that once existed between what could be done and what should never have been permitted to happen. And that boundary, once crossed, did not close again, but remained open long enough for the lie to settle into permanence, and for the photograph to smile its quiet, convincing smile at anyone who failed to look closely enough to see what had been removed to make it appear whole, and what it means now that someone finally has, and cannot unsee it, and cannot pretend that the story ends where the records stop. Because it does not. It only pauses there, waiting for the next realization to push it further into the light, where it was never intended to exist, and where it now refuses to remain silent any longer, because silence was always its most carefully maintained feature. And once that feature begins to crack, everything that depended on it begins to shift. And the expert understands that this is only the second moment where the ground gives way, and that whatever comes next will no longer be contained within documents or photographs, but will demand a reckoning with the implications of having uncovered something that was never meant to resurface, and that knowledge, once acquired, cannot be returned to where it came from, because it has already altered the shape of the past, and with it, the present understanding of what that past was built to conceal, and the realization continues to unfold without resolution or relief, pressing forward into territory that offers no clear endpoint, only the certainty that the lie was not a mistake, not an accident, not a misunderstanding, but a solution deliberately chosen, and that understanding this changes everything that follows and everything that has already been seen, and everything that will now be impossible to look at the same way again. Because the moment the second turning point locks into place, the story no longer belongs to the photograph or the family, but to the consequences of finally recognizing how thoroughly the truth was replaced and how willingly the world accepted the substitute without ever asking what after third full and without that cost in full. And an appeal when realizes that the expert realizes that the truth, not the photographs afar, for is not the deepest layer forward of the photograph's deception, but merely its foundation. What finally fractures any remaining distance between analysis and horror is the recognition that the substitution of the sister was not meant to solve a temporary crisis, but to permanently seal something far worse. The photograph, the records, the silence, all of it begins to align toward a single, inescapable implication. The family was not hiding a disappearance, but normalizing an outcome that required absolute compliance from everyone involved. This realization begins with a detail that had previously seemed incidental. The ages of the children, when recalculated without the altered dates, reveal something deeply disturbing. The eldest child's birth predates the original wife's disappearance by only months, yet the spacing between the remaining children suggests pregnancies that overlap uncomfortably with the period when the sister would have been living in the same household as a minor. The expert re-examines the sister's recorded age at the time she becomes the wife, and feels a tightening certainty that this was not a role she stepped into as an adult, but one she was forced to inhabit before she had any legal or social power to refuse. What crystallizes this turning point is the understanding that the sister's replacement of the mother was not simply about appearances, inheritance, or convenience. It was about containment. By positioning her at the center of the family, the household ensured that no external authority would question her presence, her condition, or her compliance. Marriage erased scrutiny. Motherhood erased ambiguity. The role was a shield not for her, but against what she represented. The expert understands now that the photograph's greatest function was not to preserve memory, but to override it. The children's expressions take on a new meaning under this realization. Their stillness is no longer the product of studio discipline, but of learned silence. They are not confused by the arrangement because it is the only version of reality they were allowed to know. The woman they are told is their mother is also their sister. And the truth of that contradiction is buried so early that it never has language to surface. The photograph captures not just a family, but a system that trained its members to accept impossibility as normal. The father's presence, once simply ominous, now becomes central to the horror. His position behind the seated figures is no longer symbolic of authority, but of control. He is not part of the image emotionally because he does not need to perform. The photograph exists to legitimize his decisions, not to question them. Every document that follows reinforces this arrangement, and the expert realizes that the system worked because it required no overt violence once the roles were established. The damage was self-sustaining. Emotionally, this turning point is devastating because it removes any illusion that the story contains a victim who can be recovered or redeemed. The sister did not survive the substitution. She was consumed by it. Her identity was dismantled piece by piece until only the function remained. There is no record of resistance, because resistance would have had nowhere to go. The expert understands that the absence of protest is not evidence of consent, but of total enclosure. The final weight of this realization settles when the expert considers why the photograph feels so composed, so successful in its deception. It is because everyone in it has already learned what is required of them. The children know not to ask. The sister knows not to exist beyond her assigned role. The father knows the world will accept whatever is presented cleanly enough. The photograph is not hiding chaos. It is displaying the end result of it being fully resolved in favor of control. This third turning point does not introduce new evidence so much as it reorders everything already known. The missing mother is no longer the central absence. She becomes the first removal in a sequence that ends with something far more enduring: the erasure of a boundary. The expert understands that what happened in that household was not an anomaly, but an exploitation of a system designed to protect appearances over people. The horror lies not in how extreme the act was, but in how easily it was absorbed into normalcy. By the time the expert reaches this realization, the photograph has ceased to be an object of study. It has become an accusation. It asks not what happened, but how many layers of legitimacy are required to make something unforgivable appear acceptable. The expert knows now that exposing the truth will not restore justice, because justice requires living witnesses and consequences. What it will do instead is fracture the illusion that such arrangements were rare or isolated. The final shift is internal. The expert understands that the photograph has changed the nature of their work forever. Every family portrait from this era now carries the potential for similar violence, hidden behind etiquette and posture. The act of looking can no longer be neutral. To observe without questioning feels like participation. The expert recognizes that the most disturbing aspect of the photograph is not what it reveals, but what it teaches. That history does not only forget by accident, but by design, and that once a lie is dressed convincingly enough, it does not need to be defended. It only needs to be repeated until it becomes the version that survives. The story ends not with discovery, but with choice. The expert sits alone in the archive long after closing hours, the photograph resting on the desk beneath a dim lamp, its edges curled like something trying to retreat back into darkness. Every fact has been traced as far as it can go. There are no living descendants willing to speak, no authorities left to hold accountable, no grave that can be definitively named. The truth exists now only in fragments, measurements, absences, contradictions, assembled into a narrative that cannot be proven in court, but cannot be unseen by the mind. Publishing the findings would change little. It would be read as a curiosity, a disturbing footnote to a distant century, debated and diluted until the human cost dissolved into abstraction. The expert understands this with painful clarity. History has a way of neutralizing horror by placing it safely out of reach. What survives is not the suffering, but the spectacle of it, and the photograph, stripped of context, would continue to circulate, its quiet order intact, its lie preserved even in exposure. Instead, the expert does something smaller and more deliberate. The original label is removed. The neat caption identifying a mother, father, and children is replaced with a single, carefully chosen line that refuses to explain and refuses to lie. It does not accuse. It does not speculate. It simply acknowledges uncertainty where certainty was once falsely imposed. The photograph is returned to the archive not as a solved mystery, but as an unsettled one. As the light is switched off and the door locked, the expert takes one last look. The family remains exactly as they have always been. Still, composed, convincing. But now there is a fracture running invisibly through the image, a fault line only visible to those who know how to look. The line no longer feels complete. It has been interrupted, however quietly. The photograph will endure, as it was meant to. But it will no longer be alone in its deception. Somewhere in the margins of history, doubt has been restored, and with it the acknowledgement that what appears whole may be built on something missing, something replaced, something never allowed to exist again, except as a silence that finally learned how to be heard.